York. My name is Brendan Embser, and I'm the senior editor of Aperture magazine, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all today. We are going to be joined by three incredibly talented photographers who have a strong history with Aperture magazine and Aperture's opportunities for engagement, including the Portfolio Prize, one of our signature moments at Aperture. Today, we are joined by Felipe Romero Beltrán, Samantha Box, and Mark Armijo McKnight, who will discuss their recent artistic endeavors since receiving recognition from the Aperture Portfolio Prize, their projects, their books, their artistic visions. And this panel includes both winners of the Portfolio Prize and runners-up. The Aperture Portfolio Prize is an annual competition to discover, exhibit, and publish new talents in photography. The purpose of the prize is to identify trends in photography and highlight artists whose work deserves greater recognition. Past winners and runners-up have gone on to have impressive careers and publications, and we're very proud to be part of that story for numerous photographers over the last 10 years. Just to name a few, Eli Durst is a regular contributor to the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine. Alejandro Cartagena has a successful publishing practice in Mexico and has published numerous best-selling photo books of his own work. LaToya Ruby Frazier won a MacArthur Genius Fellowship and will have a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York next year. And Ramel Ross was nominated for an Oscar for his documentary feature about Hale County in Alabama and has just published a book with Mac. And they are just a few of the many impressive and exciting photographers that we've had the privilege to engage with through the Aperture Portfolio Prize over the last several years. For those of you who might not be familiar with Aperture and are joining us for the first time, Aperture is a nonprofit publisher that leads conversations around photography worldwide. From our base in New York City, Aperture connects global audiences and supports artists through our acclaimed quarterly magazine, books, exhibitions, digital platforms, public programs, limited edition prints, and awards. This year's Portfolio Prize is generously supported by NPB. Aperture's programs are made possible by the generosity of our board of trustees, our members, and other individuals, and by the New York State Legislature. I'd also like to thank our subscribers to Aperture magazine who truly keep us going from year to year, from 1952 until the present, and who support our programs. We are incredibly grateful for your dedication and your support of Aperture. The 2024 Aperture Portfolio Prize is now open. You can learn more about it on aperture.org. The prize, we are accepting applications to the prize through January 5th, 2024, so get your work ready. We encourage anyone who is interested to submit their work, so we'll be putting a link in the chat for you to learn more. The only entry requirement is being a print subscriber to Aperture magazine, and today we are extending a 30% discount on a yearly subscription to the magazine. I sincerely hope you will take advantage. Subscribe to submit your work to the Portfolio Prize, and you will also receive the most recent issue of Aperture called Desire, which just launched today. So we will be speaking with three wonderful photographers who I mentioned earlier and going through their work one by one, and then we'll have a roundtable conversation, and we'll also be taking your questions. If you have questions at any time during the program, please feel free to add them to the Q&A, and we may bring them up in the roundtable. So I would first like to invite Felipe Romero Beltrán to join us on screen. Felipe Beltrán is a Colombian photographer now currently based in Paris. I'm just going to share my screen so you can begin to see his work. Bear with me. Felipe focuses on social issues dealing with the tension that new narratives introduce in the field of documentary photography. He is currently preparing a PhD in photography in Madrid, and his practice is characterized by an interest in social matters and long-term projects, in particular questions around migration and belonging in Europe. Felipe's book called Dialect was published by Loose Joints this year and was nominated for the Aperture Photo Book Awards as Book of the Year. He is also the winner of the Paul Huff Award and will have an exhibition at Foam in Amsterdam next year. It's such a pleasure to have you here, Felipe, and I'll just start by mentioning that when you were the winner of the Aperture Portfolio Prize in 2022, Felipe's work was published in Aperture magazine with an essay by Kaylin Wilson Goldie. One of the prizes that is involved with winning the Aperture Portfolio Prize is a portfolio and an essay in Aperture magazine in print and online. And we were thrilled to work with both you and Kaylin on this piece, and also to present your work at Baxter Street, which is Aperture's partner for the Aperture Portfolio Prize exhibitions each year. So these are some installation views of Felipe's work, Dialect, in New York City when it was presented as part of the prize program. So Felipe, it's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you again and to have had the privilege of engaging with your work over the last several years. So do you want to just take us through a little bit about your practice in general and Dialect, which was the series that won the Aperture Portfolio Prize, and how that led to your book and your other types of work recently?
Yeah, so absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your invitation, and also thank you to everyone listening up on my perspective of this work. So as you told Brendan, my work generally is engaged with the things that are completely close to me in one sense or another. So this is the case of Dialect. I started the project in 2020 because I was invited to a workshop to share my own experience as a migrant in Colombia, in Seville, in South Spain. And over there were, different profiles of people, of communities, and one of them were this group of young migrants that recently crossed the Mediterranean Sea after the first lockdown of the COVID, and arrived to Seville. So this is the general, let's say, the general field of the approach of Dialect series. Then I start to take pictures at the beginning, not for, let's say, for a project, but more for them, to be honest. And then I realized there is something that were happening within the group, and also some intensities on the relation that we were developing. So after a few months, I asked the group if they were willing to start a project in collaboration during these 3 years. It's a 3-year project because it's the amount of time that you normally need as a migrant if you arrive with the documentation in Spain to get residency and the papers in order. So I knew from the beginning it would be a 3-year period project. And then at the same time, for me, the projects normally are more of like a learning practice, a learning field for my own experience as a photographer, and also, of course, as a human being. So we dedicate the last 3 years to make this project, sometimes with kind of a, let's say, documentary-based approach. But then I realized that I need to approach or use a tool or trying to relate to their own stories through different approaches or through different mediums. So the first exercise that I start to work on was these kind of images that you are seeing here. There actually are reenactments of past experiences from Tangier in Morocco to Seville. So in that sense, these reenactments were a tool for through documentary practice-based photography, bring events from the past on their experiences. Sometimes there were experiences, sometimes were dreams, sometimes were different approaches of representation of the group that helps me to build this body of work.
And can I just ask you the process for learning about the stories and dreams or episodes that you were reenacting through this
yeah, well, basically
that we
was
see in your photographs? Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Basically was at the beginning was a way to keep working with them, because I spent tons of times talking, and of course I was also there to help them to improve their Spanish skills. So we had tons of talks, and then I realized that all those experiences, I should bring them to the work. So at the beginning I tried interviews. I tried some writings, writing pieces. But then I wanted to, or I had the intention to keep it on the photographic image. So that's why basically I start to do these reenactments, and also as a tool to bring also some stories that of course are not, doesn't belong to me, and then it's also a way to bring it up to the project. Um, so this year we published the book with loose joints. It's actually here, and the book
Mm-hmm.
has 3 parts. The first part, it's let's say the sequence of images that you're seeing right now.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a second part that I also trying to push my own, let's say my own perspectives as a photographer, doing some video piece on some video work around the relation between the body and the language, because of course you have the images, but then you have a strong political case that is the core of the project. So I presented a piece that it's called recital in Spanish, recital in English, I guess, and it's a video piece where they read the first 4 pages of the immigration law without knowing exactly what they're saying, and at the same time knowing that this exact document, exact file, defines and categorizes a migrant in Spain. So for me, it was important to play this kind of a tension between the body and the language within the book, because of course this political layer was the core, or the beginning somehow of the project. Then at the end of the book, I ask 6 different people that includes two of the participants, Zacharias and Yusef, to write something that were not directly related to the project, but that resonates with it. So I asked, to be honest, people that were around me, as Zacharias and Yusef, but at the same time, people that engage with the project from different disciplines, as choreography, as anthropology, and also philosophy and physics.
What kind of training did you have in your background that not only provided a space for you to make images so beautifully, but also to think about these social questions through ideas around social practice or documentary styles that are adjacent to journalism but aren't the same as journalism? I mean, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Bogota, in Colombia, and in the 90s. So it's the 90s were a specific political and social situation in Colombia that, of course, instantly relates to politics and social issues within my own country, within my own identity, in consequence of the political and civil war that we had in the last century. After that, I moved to Argentina to study photography. So I've been always related to academics somehow because I try to look for scholarships or fundings or residencies that allows me to keep working on my photographic practice. And of course, Argentina has a really strong background on social, and as a photography as a tool of social change. So I was educated in that context, and then I moved for almost 2 years to Jerusalem in Israel and Palestine. So that's also something that I think influenced me to work in this kind of multi-layered projects, not only from the photographic image, but also from a political case and also reflection from different languages to approach one case or one device, in this case, dialect. After that, I did my master degree in Madrid, thanks to a scholarship also, and now I'm finishing my PhD in photography in Madrid.
And I just want to go back quickly to some of the images that are published in the book, some of which were also in the exhibition with Aperture. When did you find your voice, or that is to say, your style as a photographer? Because your way of making portraits is very recognizable, although I don't know if I can articulate exactly what it is. It's recognizable, but when you were working on dialect, did you feel like you were really getting in the groove and getting your style, or did you feel like you had done that in some other project, preceding dialect?
Yes, I mean, to be honest, still feel that I'm in a learning path. That's why also I like to think of project as a learning fields in that sense. And of course, with the failures, and of course with the let's say not close projects in a way. So that's interesting what you're saying, because I didn't see it like that. But I'm always trying to work from the photographic image. That it's also really important for my practice. We used to verbalize everything that we're doing through the images, and still I'm trying to leave some space to nonverbal thoughts or nonverbal approaches when I'm doing when I'm working on photography. So that's maybe the only thing that I'm realized until now, that I'm still wanted to think about images on a nonverbal sense. And that's why maybe you can feel something, particular on the images, but I'm still on the way to learn, and let's say to consolidate a way of seeing.
Well, that's the strength, among others, about dialect, is that there's a consistency of approach, but as you say, a lot of mystery, a lot of nonverbal aspects, and a lot of openness to interpretation. But I would say a strong social and political undercurrent that makes the work both very much of our time, but also I think work that will be very, very rewarding to return to in the future. And just to conclude your aspect of the presentation today, Felipe, I wanted to mention that you produced an incredibly beautiful story for Holiday magazine about Turkey, which was published this year. And the reason why I was asking about your style is that when I saw this work in Holiday, I instantly recognized that it was you that who was behind the camera. And when we saw each other recently in Paris, I asked you whether or not, when you make a story like this for another magazine, you keep the images yourself, and that they may then be used, in future projects, which is to say you have your, even though you're working for a client, you have your eye on something else. Is that the correct way of interpreting it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. As I told before, dialect was a learning field for my way of approaching, and of course, at the end of photography, it's a decision of a light, decision of a distance with the subject, and also decision of a point of view. So so it's me. I try to keep it in that sense, and I think this time, of course, because it was specifically the Istanbul issue, it was kind of organic the way that we work with especially related to the concept of the story, and also on the relation with the models that were, one of them were from Morocco too. So, like, it was completely organic in that sense. And of course, it has like a different, let's say, approach and a different market also. But at the same time, I try to keep pushing on these kind of questions and issues on the visuals that I'm interested in.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We'll hear more from you at the round table in a few minutes, but I will, in the meantime, invite Samantha Box to join us on camera. And Felipe, thank you very much. Our next guest on this panel is Samantha Box. Are you there, Samantha?
I
am. Samantha Box is a Jamaican-born Bronx-based photographer. She holds an MFA in Advanced Photographic Studies from ICP Bard and a certificate in photojournalism and documentary studies from the International Center of Photography. She has been awarded the ANIFA NISCA Fellowship in Photography twice. And in 2023, she was shortlisted for the Aperture Portfolio Prize, the Louis Redor Discovery Award, and the Prix de la Photo Madame Figaro. Her work is in the collections of the Museum of Fine Art, Houston, and the Harvard Art Museums. I had the pleasure of speaking with Samantha on the occasion of her being a finalist for the Aperture Portfolio Prize this year, and learning quite a lot about her work and incredible, very, very deeply layered, mysterious, but also precise still lifes, which we will start with here. So Samantha, I just wanted to start with the question that you and I talked about earlier this year, and that I was amused by, and I think you bring to it both a sense of amusement, but also a sense of political commitment. But what exactly are Caribbean dreams, and what was the original reference there when you were thinking about the title of this body of work?
Sure. So before I begin, actually, I'd like to thank you, Alex, Brianna, and Aperture for inviting me to this panel, and for also shortlisting me for this prize, and for our wonderful conversation and the article that you wrote, which is like still my favorite piece ever written about my work. And I also would like to thank everyone who's here today. Thanks for coming to this talk. So Caribbean Dreams is just sort of loosely speaking, before I sort of address that question, is like a body of work that has a number of subcomponents. But taken together, those components are basically trying to articulate a super subjective space of my own personal experience as a person of multiple racial diasporas, multiple island diasporas, who is also an immigrant to the US, who's also living in a diasporic city, New York. In this work, I use my body, fruits and veg. There are some family objects and some sort of regionally referent objects, such as this one, actually, that, and this is actually sort of the image in which the title Caribbean Dreams comes from, which, have sort of become, as the work has progressed, unmoored from their original origins. But these things are sort of analogies for bodies, knowledge, cultures that have been historically and contemporaneously transported, migrated, and commodified over across nation state boundaries. So, Caribbean Dreams, actually, this is again the piece, the image from which the title comes from. And it comes from that can of Ackies there. And there's a sort of larger backstory to how Ackies and saltfish become the Jamaican national dish. And it's directly related to enslavement. It's directly sort of related to these other sort of global histories of commodification of products such as cod, such as tomatoes. This image actually sort of talks as well about the ways that culture gets, especially if one is in diaspora, gets sort of regulated across a boundary. So for a very long time, when I was growing up, one could not actually get Ackies. And so because they were sort of classified as being sort of suspect or sort of poisonous. And in recent days, in years, actually, there's been an influx of diasporic products, particularly to like areas like I live in the Bronx in a pretty diverse area. With this influx of diasporic products, as if like there's been sort of like this acknowledgement that like many of us, especially from the Caribbean, are actually living in diaspora. Most of us are in diaspora. You know, when I saw this can of Ackies, actually, I was going to buy Ackies for myself to eat. And I saw this idea of Caribbean dreams. And it really sort of reminded me of like, whose dream is this? And like the dream, whose dream of the Caribbean? Also, the way in which the Caribbean has been something that's been historically constructed in studio. It has been someone's sort of like fever dream of either sort of like commercial exploitation or like kind of this, the exploitation around the concept of paradise. And it was also just kind of like strange and funny at the same time. It's like, this is just slightly messed up, you know? In studio, one thing that is really important to me is that so much of our understanding of the Caribbean comes from a studio space. And so like sort of subverting the idea of the still life, or trying to kind of like push back against the way that, for example, in an image like this directly relates to, it's one of the first images of the body of work actually, wherein I was really considering the ways that 17th century still lifes from the Netherlands are essentially sort of advertisements of the empire, right? Like there are these collections of luxury products from like different parts of the empire, essentially sort of like a promotional, like sort of like, like go ahead, like go and take things from these people who are in these far-flung places. I think we don't think about the Dutch as being imperial, but in fact they were, right? And that's what the still life is a record of. And so, in my case, I'm thinking about like what are the fruits of the empire literally coming into the empire state. And this image and the one next to it, like I'm also returning back to personhood, the figure that sometimes is in these still lives of a Black, often boy. There was a sort of mirrored one originally, but like, who is couched as being an object, right? And so like, what does it mean to return personhood back to that individual? And so, from this idea of like, kind of like this rogue hand, like plucking at this like still life or eating in the other case of, comes this desire that I have to really sort of like break up what the value of a still life is, right? Because again, if the original idea of a still life is a sort of collection of luxury products that is in fact itself a luxury product, there's value written into a still life. And there's also value written into like a photograph, right? And so a lot of things that I think about are like, where does the value lie in this image? In an image like this, for example, this is an in-camera multiple exposure, like there is really sort of in some ways like nothing of the thing that is of value is actually the thing that's almost entirely obscured by the light leak, which is that seedling, right? The image of the Caribbean that appears, that black and white image, is something that iterates out across like a lot of the body of work. And in fact, I'm preparing work now for a solo show that's going to be at the Des Moines Art Center in 2024. And like in that, like this, like that backdrop has decayed, right? Like that avocado that is being born in this picture is gone now, And so like there are these, in this work, especially the stuff that I submitted for the Portfolio Prize, it's actually, in many ways, it speaks of multiple points of origin that in my current practice are actually sort of like decaying at this point. So in fact, speaking of decay, the only plants in this picture that are alive are those 2 pineapple plants. Everything else is dead. But like that image, the image before and this image really, kind of were, points, like significant points in positioning this work within a very, very specifically studio-based diasporic space, right? So I'm talking about what it means to be in this flux, right? I started planting whatever fruits, the seeds from whatever fruits and vegetables that I could find in my green market from which I source all of my fruits and vegetables, which is like 2 blocks away from where I live. And thinking about like, what does it mean to sort of sustain and to nurture and to care for these things in the ways in which like the grow light becomes an analogy for that. But at the same time, like all of us who are immigrants, who are the descendants of enslaved people, who are the descendants of the indentured, like there is this sort of like implicit price tag that on us, right? Like, like this like value of the labor. And also this one, this image and the one after it are basically like some of the first two in which I really started like using, I'm sorry, I apologize. I thought there was a different image there, but like where I really started to think about like the materiality of like the fruit stickers and the receipts as like, you know, essentially like really bringing that analogy of immigration that's like born in these diasporic products, in the fruits of these diasporas, and like really sort of cementing that with an immigrant or migrant or enslaved or indentured experience, historically and contemporaneously.
And the barcode appears multiple times, which I love as a kind of metaphor and a point of entry.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like what's really interesting about like, I really sometimes I look at those barcodes and I think like this is not so dissimilar from like our own passports right now. Right. You know, and, you know, I think often like, you know, really positioning this work in diaspora too is something that I think is sort of like my way of like pushing back against that kind of like immigrant narrative that really is labor based, that really is value based, right? And so, and again, like the value of like what is the value of your body, what is the value of the work that you do, and like also like the way that like if you know become a naturalized citizen, it's like you have to prove that, and I think that's like really fascinating, and something that needs to be sort of talked about. You know, one of the other things like thinking about like the way that and like really sort of like doubling down on like the construction, like the studio as a constructed space, that really is something that talks like that is directly related to the way the Caribbean is a constructed space. Um, as colonies and like sort of economic colonies, and then later on as like a space of paradise, right? And like when we think about like going to the Caribbean, like this is a constructed idea, right? That follows you know, tourism as like the idea of like another level of exploitation. And so like in early days of especially in Victorian era photography, like this was often signified in the bodies of like young women. So this is happening across the globe, right? But you know, I was in this image, like I'm really, you know, thinking about what it means to for these images of like young indentured Indian girls to be sort of like used in that way. And like, you know, like the personal family connection here is that like my mother, who is seen in almost all of these pictures surrounding, is actually descended, her father's half sister is widely considered to be the last uh, indentured Indian to come to Trinidad. And so like this is like a really sort of personal family story in many ways. And like, and but like thinking, you know, I wanted to address this history, but like I realized that like in the act of recapitulating the photograph, in fact, I was reinscribing the history. And so the pixelation became a way of shielding her and also me, like, you know, from this, like from re-exploitation. The images, with the exception of the lower left one, are all images from my mother's and her sister's lives. And actually the lower left are images of my grandmother. That's my grandmother and her mother and her sister. And like it's not like about this idea of like exceptionalism, but it's just more like the idea of refuting a calcification that's inherent in this colonial era image that then gets carried over again, you know, into these ideas of like what we think about the Caribbean, you know. And then, you know, I think about often quoting Firelei Baez, like, you know, like the Caribbean as a, you know, crucible of the modern world, where we sort of like learn about these ideas of identity, self-knowledge, you know, things like botany, things like race come from the New World, come from places like the Caribbean, you know, and like, what does it mean to sort of directly confront that? And again, like, you know, I know I keep on saying this, like the studio is this place where like, you know, one can deconstruct and reconstruct these ideas. The image surface is also a place where like the base, a lot of, you know, transplant family portrait, this one, and then moving onwards, like it's kind of like a happy tick, if you want to call it that, but it's also my way of like really kind of like, you know, in placing an image on top of a base layer, um, really sort of destabilizing the narrative. You know, it's also like sort of like this inherent act of wanting to pack it all in, right? Like to sort of like pack in multitudes. But what does it mean when, you know, in the act of looking at all multiple points of an image like this, which is sort of there's three different like identity layers of myself here, none of which are the ones that are actually have been described by me, but in fact, like there's like my official passport. That's the photograph of me. This is actually based on my naturalization certificate. Like, what is the sense of identity that sort of like I am still myself, but somehow I'm described in three different ways across nation state borders, which and it's like the fallacy of that, right? And like but the act of sort of like placing things on top of other things is really sort of like an attempt to destabilize an image, and then to also then destabilize the narrative, and then again the value of what a photograph holds, what a print holds, what the surface of the print holds.
Well, what I like about your collage works, if that's how you describe them, in fact, is that the images from the past seem to say that, well, the past is past, but the present is still coming into focus, especially
Right.
especially
Yeah.
the one with the pixelated portrait. Yeah.
And actually, what's really I was gonna be like, what's really interesting about my work, but like, not in that kind of sense of hubris, but like, in the when these images are printed, like, some of these, there are digital aspects, like sort of like digital insertions. I sort of like don't want to use the word collage, but like digital insertions, but also physical insertions. And so, for example, in an image like this photograph is or image is traditionally printed at such a scale that that postcard is at postcard size, and it is actually an overlay on top of the image, And so like there is this kind of thing about like, where do we look, right? Like what is, and again, like, so in an image like this, like the only thing that's like, quote, of value is actually the golden bracelet, which is a family heirloom. But like, it's not really like, I mean, the more the work sort of goes on, it's like the less these things become connected to like my family actually, and become sort of like more these other sort of like symbols of a flux than anything else, right? But like that is the only thing that's really sort of valuable, right? Where do you look in this picture for the thing to hold on to? And in this case too, it's like, where do you look, right? So like this is a fractured, I did this sort of like with the scanner of picture of a already sort of decaying like Polaroid of me in Jamaica, right? And this was also sort of like one of those points in which like there was, after I did this, I looked at it and I was just like, yeah, like this work is actually not about this traditional idea of an immigrant returning back to home, but in fact, it felt as if it like literally was a fracturing of these essentialist and nostalgic ideas of homeland that really sort of like also underscore an American narrative or just a Western narrative of an immigration, right? And sometimes it actually gets used in this case as like in a three-dimensional object, which is like this like side practice that I have because I like to make things. And like this portable homeland is in particular sort of based on the Wardian cases, which are early greenhouses that were used by early botanists when they were going into the Caribbean or other sort of colonial spaces to bring plants back to the metropole, so like to Kew Gardens and stuff like that. In this picture, well, I think about this as actually a three-dimensional picture. Like I am trying to basically talk about like what would a physical representation of diaspora look like? What would my own diasporic landscape look like? And this particular box is actually planted up with medicinal plants, but it's still alive. Actually, it functions. And it also sort of like talks about like in the way that it moves and can move. This idea of sort of like a land, my own sort of like place of birth, if you want to call it that. The island from which I am from could be represented in this box. And then just sort of like thinking about this, and this is actually one of the trajectories that I'm really interested in these days, is like, what does that look like photographically as well? Here is a lot of the things that I end up using, like, for example, that's a very, very deliberately low res image in the bottom, right? And so like when it's printed, it sort of stands proud over the surface of the image. There's this kind of like needing to sort of like look, it sort of like feels like a punching out into this other space. So I've been thinking about like what does like within this kind of like deeply personal space that I'm talking about in studio, what does that look like? What does the landscape of my diaspora look like? And then also like within that, it means that like products or objects that have been used previously start taking on a different valence, right? So like now these Christmas cakes, which appear in at least 3 pictures, like become kind of like their own mobile entity, they are branded in some ways, like, so a Supreme Jamaican product actually is coming from another diasporic thing, meant, like a soup mix. And, but like, it's interesting to me how like now, like the way that these products have their own level of history in the way that can of Aki does, and the way that Aki's did and do, this is kind of like adding to it. And then, like this is also sort of like, this is a multiple exposure and also an earlier image as well. But it's, something that I think about often because it's really, I think, going back to the narrative of migration often, or immigration, there is this kind of like caught between two worlds, like sort of like language, but this isn't about that. Like this is actually about sort of like the mashup, and, in one thing that I think really, there's like a number of things that I think like mark this, like the work up until actually this year, which are like this idea of like how to an increasing sort of like fascination with the idea of multiplicity, origins, and again, like sort of like unstable narratives and like what that means in terms of the value of an image as a still life, especially.
And then I just want to move quickly to
yes, definitely.
another aspect of this project, which are the flashcards. And yeah, tell us a little bit about this, and we'll see how these get activated in the physical world as well as we go through.
Sure, and if you want to just kind of like go through them, because like there's like they're essentially the same.
Definitely.
But these are kind of like, this is like a technically ongoing body of work that like is accompanied usually by a sound piece. My parents were academics, and so one of my earliest memories is being taught flashcards by my mother. But so like what this work, it started off as like when I do still life, it's a really sort of tactile process. And so like looking at the way that my hands are engaging with the fruits and the veg. Also like, my first degree is in biology. And so like I'm endlessly fascinated with the way, like this like sort of like aspect of like, of the erasure. So this is not to say that like, I'm not like pushing necessarily back against science, but like, but there is an erasure of like sort of vernacular knowledge that happens with the flattening of a genus species name. There is like this kind of like exploitation that happens where it's just like, like this is how you could use this plant and this is what it looks like. And so I really wanted to kind of like push back against that. So like the descriptions, the visual descriptions of the fruit are basically to teach me, right, about what they look like. But the names of the fruits and veg in the flashcards are basically the names that my mother taught me. So it's like our sort of family vernacular for these things. And so naming them in that way, it returns some of like this erased knowledge back, right, into sort of like circulation. And again, like, so like the flashcards like are accompanied usually by a sound piece where she's saying the names and I'm repeating them. But it's like, like the difference in like her accent versus my accent, like it's not about like the sort of like the breaking of things, but rather about like the bending or like the flexing of culture around, again, this arbitrary nation state line, right? So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I'm reminded of our long conversations earlier this year, and all the stories that are layered together in your work, not only about your personal history and growing up in New Jersey and all the stories you had about the people who were surrounding you, but also the ways that you bring that to bear with your research into botany and many other aspects. So it's really a pleasure to engage with your work again. So we will hear more from you in just a few minutes. And thank you so much, Samantha. And Mark, I will then invite you to please join us. So I'm delighted to introduce Mark Armijo McKnight, who's an artist who's been exhibited internationally and reviewed in many esteemed publications, including the Los Angeles Times Interview, the New Yorker, GQ, Aperture, Art in America, Frieze, Brooklyn Rail, and Moose, among many others. Mark has been a Fulbright Scholar and the recipient of the 2019 Aperture Portfolio Prize, a 2020 Lightwork Photo Book Award, and a 2020 Rima Hortman Emerging Artist Grant. And he is also a 2023 Guggenheim Fellow, which is a very illustrious history. The Guggenheim has had such an incredible impact on what we think of when we think about American photography. And he had a book that was published also by Loose Joints 2 years ago, which we will talk about. And I will just show you quickly. Mark was the winner of the Aperture Portfolio Prize in 2019, and his work appeared in the fall issue with an essay by the brilliant writer Garth Greenwell, who is also a MacArthur Fellow and who teaches in Iowa, and whose criticism has appeared in the New Yorker, among many other places. These are some photographs of Mark's exhibition for the Portfolio Prize at Aperture's former space on 27th Street, which looked beautiful. Among other talents, Mark is an exquisite printmaker, so it's really a joy to see your work in person. And for those of you who saw this exhibition, I'm sure you'll recall that. And one element about Mark and our kind of story together is that through the Aperture Portfolio Prize and Garth Greenwell, Mark actually became friends with Garth, which I love, and made the cover image of the paperback edition of Cleanness, which was a book that Garth published in 2020. And the last event that we ever held in public at the former Aperture Gallery, and by coincidence right before the pandemic, was an incredibly memorable and beautiful conversation between Garth and Mark, which I think is one of my favorite moments of public engagement during my time at Aperture. So it's a pleasure to speak with you again, Mark, and I'm thrilled to see all the different journeys that your work has taken since we first collaborated. Feels like an age ago, back in 2019. So why don't we start with a body of work, Mark, that you submitted to the Aperture Portfolio Prize and published, and then became kind of the work that we know you so well for your gallery exhibitions and many other moments.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was like it was a treat to hear more about Felipe and Samantha's practices, and it's always nice to reconnect with you and everybody and anybody at Aperture. You've all been so great to me. So yeah, nice to be here. I guess just generally speaking, I'll say I'm really interested in ideas around the body, queerness, landscape, and poetics. As you heard, I was awarded the Portfolio Prize in 2019. That was for a project called Decreation, which, like, at this juncture feels maybe less like a specific body of work and more like the title for like my entire creative endeavor, probably including some subsequent bodies of work that I'll get into in a little bit. But just to give some backstory, so Decreation, it's an idea put forth by mystic, theologian, philosopher Simone Weil in a posthumously published collection of essays that was titled Gravity and Grace. And in it, she coins and defines this term decreation, which she says is quote, to make something created pass into the uncreated, which is not to be confused with outright destruction or annihilation. It's rather, it's a kind of like undoing of a thing in ways that I think of as more transcendent, perhaps like a return to some kind of a base state. And I'm really interested in that and in thinking about flux and the ways in which, like, all things are in a kind of perpetual state of becoming and unbecoming. And so a lot of this thinking that I'm interested in and doing finds its way into the images that I'm making of body and landscape. I'd also say there's a kind of more political facet to my work that has evolved out of what I would say is a kind of like conflicted relationship to the history of the medium. I'm obviously, attuned to the strategies of modernist photography, but also really acutely aware of the like narrow scope of the like very narrow scope of history, the narrow scope of experience shared by like its most celebrated practitioners, as a like fat, queer, brown, mixed race Latino. I'm invested in retroactively inserting desires and values and subjectivities into the canon from which I was educated, and from which my body and identity were sometimes or almost always painfully absent. The sort of blemished landscapes and the bodies I represent, as well as my insistence on beauty and the significance of subject matter that might otherwise be deemed like taboo or abject, really, in my mind, runs counter to modernism's pristine utopic vision. And so maybe to say that all more simply, I'm really interested in a kind of queering of what would be referred to often as straight photography.
One thing that, sorry to interrupt you there, but one element that I just wanted to bring up that Garth Greenwell articulates beautifully is that you seem to create a space of what he called sympathy, both for the flesh and the landscape. And it's so interesting to me to see, as you did with the Portfolio Prize exhibition, and I think throughout your work, just very incredibly detailed, gorgeous landscapes, but that, as you just said, don't really draw on that modernist awe or the spectacle of the landscape as such, but they're deeply connected to physical experiences. Can you talk a little bit about that dialogue between the earth and flesh that we see so much in your work?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm really interested. When I started, it was this talk, I mentioned poetics, and like metaphor is really essential to me. And I would maybe argue that the metaphors I'm interested in, it's not sort of one directional. It's not purely anthropocentric. I'm interested also in thinking about it's not just body as landscape, it's also landscape as body. And I'm interested in that reciprocity. And maybe in terms of sort of thinking about ecology and some of my ecologic concerns, there's just something really important to me about trying to separate or rather trying to work towards a kind of unity so that we don't see ourselves so separate from the landscapes that we inhabit, if that makes sense. I guess I was also going to say, though, that in terms of this sort of a political aspects of the work, it's also reflected by my materials and process. So in camera, I'm often underexposing, and then in the darkroom, I'm typically overexposing images. I'm really interested in like burying the kinds of descriptive details that we've come to expect from a photograph. So like the shadow for me becomes a psychological space in which to get lost and project and empathize and experience, which is getting back to this question of modernism. It's really a kind of repudiation of modernism's preoccupation with ideas around purity and fidelity. I really want to make images that refuse to tell you everything, and I'd like to think that I do that by asserting and exploiting the inherent limitations of the medium as a means of like foregrounding my subjectivity. So like the subjective and the symbolic and the poetic potential of photography, which is, there's certainly some modernist photographers who were oriented that way, but certainly not the ones that got the most attention. It seems to me that the ones who really were super canonized and informed the way we think about that period in photography were really interested in ideas around the universal, which is, as beautiful as those images are, it's a kind of farce, and a one that has really painful and some troublesome results. Yeah. I guess, yeah, I'll say so. Almost immediately after getting the Portfolio Prize, probably like within days, I was contacted by Loose Joints, who became the publisher of my first monograph. If memory serves, they wanted to publish some of that work, but I had another idea for a project that more explicitly depicted desire and sex in the landscape of the high desert in Southern California, where I was raised. And what began as this idea for like a small 15 picture book turned into something much larger, which is this monograph called Heaven is a Prison that you can see on screen. That's the book, which comes wrapped in this image of a cloud that you have to tear open in order to access the contents of the book. It's a kind of defiling.
Yes, as Jesse Doris wrote in Aperture's photo book review, to get into heaven, you have to rip open the sky.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also it was like my little, I don't know, Stieglitzian, it's like part homage, part iconoclasm, and trying to sort of foreground the way I'm thinking about landscape, which is that there's always a thing behind the image, which is me and my subjectivity, but also like all of the things that I am projecting onto these spaces. That are brought to bear on the pictures and the sort of psychology of the pictures kind of collectively.
What was it like to work on this book and to translate some of the strategies that you just talked about in a dark room and your printmaking process into, a mass-produced object where, it's not gallery prints, but you still want it to look exquisite?
Yeah. Well, that was interesting because I had to I mean, I'm thrilled with how the book looks. We use like I want to say I don't typically think of myself as a book person. I've actually been more oriented towards the gallery and the wall. And so this was like a new way of thinking that was really exciting for me. But I had to, so the book, it was like a different time, Brendan, when I met you, because it was like a different world.
Yeah,
there was no such thing as COVID. And then we were going to do this book. I was supposed to go on press in Bruges so that I could oversee the printing with the loose joints folks. And then it just didn't work out. I couldn't leave the country. Even if I wanted to, like Belgium wasn't accepting people into the country. And I sent some, I think I sent some match prints, and Louis and Sarah just they made it over there, and they oversaw the whole thing. And I got lucky that they understood the way that the prints should look, yeah, the print quality for the book ended up being really beautiful.
It was beautiful, and I think it's connected to some of the modernist photographers you mentioned who are part legacy and part revision for you. I mean, just the quality of the printing and also some aspects of the subject matter, which of course then you turn on its head. And I love that that was a result in some ways of the Aperture Portfolio Prize, that conversation started with another illustrious and wonderful publisher like Loose Joints. Mark, would you like to take us quickly through your newest body of work and how some of these ideas are continuing to evolve in your photography?
Yeah. So I'm as you mentioned, I'm on Guggenheim Fellowship right now. So I'm making some new work that I'm not showing today, but I did a part of my Guggenheim time has been dedicated to editing my second monograph, which will be published by TBW Books in like late 2024. It's titled Posthume, which is I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, so any French speakers, don't be mad at me. I'm sorry, but it's the French word for posthumous, which is derived from Latin, meaning post-humus. Translated into English, that would be after Earth. And I gave it this French title first because I debuted these pictures in a 2-picture show with the death-obsessed, deceased Belgian iconoclast James Ensor. I did this show in Brussels last summer. And the work, as you can see, has taken like a little bit of a macabre turn. The images feature human subjects, often in repose, wearing these skull masks in landscapes that are punctuated by similarly skeletal dead trees. In my mind, it's a kind of memento mori in like a landscape form. I don't know if you could tell by the way I talk about the other work, but I'm sometimes a little reticent to like pin work down. I'm really interested in equivocality and multiple meanings. But I'll say that the work was made during the pandemic and amidst some like unrelated scary personal health stuff. And I was reflecting, I think, at this like hazy intersection of like the present day plague, thinking about my own health, ruminating on a generation of like queer ancestors that were lost to AIDS during the last major public health crisis in the United States, and then also thinking about what it means to like live and make art in a body and on a planet that feels like it's expiring. I know I'm Mr. like Sunshine today, but I, like the subjects of the photographs, I think I was sort of like trying death on and trying to make sense of all of these things in a very particular moment. As you can see, the pictures finally arrived at this place in which these figures, which I've affectionately started calling deadheads, they're surrounded by these wildflowers, hopefully suggesting that death isn't the end. But yeah, I'll stop there. I know we're time.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You've brought so many incredible ideas from modernist photography to the apocalypse to queerness in the landscape, all together. And I continue to be a great admirer of your work and this trajectory since we first worked together. So I would just invite everyone, please, to turn their cameras on. I realize we're over time now, so we'll do the lightning round quickly, but I'm grateful that you gave so much of your time to go into your work in depth. I appreciate that. I think I just want to ask one key question, and then we'll turn it over to the questions that people may have in the audience, which is, what does early work mean to you and to your practice? The Aperture Portfolio Prize is not only given to emerging photographers, but often it's at a critical point in a photographer's career. And this question is partly inspired by you, Samantha, because I remember when we spoke that you have a completely different body of work from your earlier years in photography, your work on the piers on the west side of Manhattan, much more figurative, social documentary oriented. And yeah, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about your early work and when you felt you got your sense of confidence, I suppose, as a photographer and as an artist. So early work is the prompt.
Should I take it away?
Yes, please go ahead. And then anyone who wants to jump in, go right ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, like my early work is in many ways very, very different than the work I'm doing now. I mean, that body of work was 12 years of black and white documentary work, working with, queer and trans youth of color in New York City. And it was definitely something that, I really sort of like only ended that work very recently when I went to graduate school, and it was in graduate school that I sort of like retooled myself, if you want to call it that, into still life, tableau, self-portrait photographer, and to the work that I'm doing now. And it was definitely, I have to say, like it, I have like this rule that's like roughly sort of like the 2-year rule that like, which is that like, I guess like when you are starting new work, it takes about 2 years for you to kind of like really get into a rhythm. But for me, actually, it's been a little bit delayed. Like one of the things that actually happened to me this year, so 4 years into this project, was a sense of confidence, I guess, if you want to call it that, like of coming back into the idea that what my ideas looked like. I mean, one of the things with still life is that you're by yourself in a studio. So there's not a lot of ping-ponging off of anyone, it's you creating. And so, yeah, it took like a while to kind of regain that confidence that I had with my earlier iteration. Like, yeah. So.
And what about you, Felipe? You mentioned your time in Israel, Palestine as a student, and I don't know that work very well, but I understand from Kaylin's essay that it's very, very different from the work that you made in dialect. What was your education, your earlier experiments of photography? How did that inform the way you work now?
Yeah, I mean, for me, yeah, it's exactly what Samantha were saying. I was at the beginning, I was trying to approach photography from so different angles or perspectives, but also thanks to the support that I had with dialect, with the Aperture Prize, it's somehow it validates my way of seeing. So that's in that sense, it's super important to validate yourself in your practice, and more so to keep questioning what you're doing. So my questions has been almost always the same, but the way that I'm working on, it feels, at least for me, much coherent and much more close to me than before.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, you are also a teacher now, and so the idea of early work is one that is ever present. I imagine. What do you think, both as a teacher and as somebody who made early work? How do you feel about those formative experiments or ideas that kind of led you to the place you are in now?
I feel like I always go back to, I feel like I end up back at some of the same ideas I'm realizing. I think sometimes it's like I can tell that I was on my way somewhere really important in the early work, but I just didn't have language for it. I think it's just a matter of making work over a certain amount of time and developing the language for it, and then you can see that in some ways you were always interested in some of these things you didn't have language for. Like I look back at like material I made in grad school that's so clearly about like silence and poetics and language and what can't be seen, and trying to arrive at depicting the images that can't fully communicate everything, and then that's part of the work. But I got so lost in conversations around like new topographics, for example, that like it totally derailed my ability to see all of these other really important things that were happening in my work. Which is, yeah, it's old stuff is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love looking back.
Well, I appreciate that it's 10 minutes after 2 and we still have a number of people on the line, which thank you for holding in for so long. I just want to close by, if you can quickly answer this last question, which is, why do you think people should enter the Aperture Portfolio Prize? Anyone can go first.
I'll just say, when I was applying, I remember there was a video that Aperture had of Latoya Ruby Frazier that I saw, and she said something like, "You can't live in fear of rejection," and that like hit me like a truck. Like I think I operated from a place of fear, maybe historically, and I actually really needed to hear that. And I think I say that to some of my students about all kinds of things. And I there was like a moment where I was like, oh, I'm not, there's no way I'm getting that. In addition to seeing that video, I had a friend in my studio who was like, you've put the material together, just hit submit. And I ended up getting the prize. So like, you're not going to get anything if you don't tell the universe that you want it.
And you made your own video, Mark, which I remember, and you were wearing an amazing coat and encouraging people to.
I did.
You made your own promo video, I seem to recall, for the Portfolio Prize,
Oh,
which
okay.
is, so you're in the trajectory now.
Okay.
What about you, Samantha, Felipe? What are your words of encouragement for anyone out there thinking about applying to the Portfolio Prize?
I mean, I would kind of say, like, echoing Mark, it's just like there's, at some point where, so yes, if you don't put yourself out there, like nothing will happen, right? That is sort of like an automatic rejection to not apply. And I think about this often, like I tell my students this, but also I think about this often with myself. Like, I mean, how will this happen? But I think that there is also a declaration of self that happens when you do apply for something like this, of saying like, I want my work to be seen in this way. And I think that beyond even what the prize is, like that actually is like really important as emerging photographers to be able to stand by what their work is. So that is why you should apply, because each application is a moment of declaration. So.
Love that. Felipe,
Yeah,
last word.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Just to close that, for me was an excellent opportunity and platform, and more so the chance to build a community also with you guys. That's for me. It's important because of course I'm not from the States. I'm not even based in your city. So for me it was really really nice approach to build a community within Aperture, within the people around the magazine, and like with more photographers to keep working together on this. So that's something that for me was like really important on the prize.
Well, I appreciate that, and it was an honor to work with all of you. And all the editors at Aperture, learned so much through this process, and we're really proud of you and excited to see your next chapters of accomplishments, photo books, exhibitions, teaching, all of it. So aperture.org, please consider submitting to the Portfolio Prize. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And thank you to our wonderful panelists. So bye-bye.